Good evening from New York. I'm Lawrence O'Donnell. As part of the White House's pushback against disappointed Democratic lawmakers and some of its angry liberal base, National Economic Council Director Larry Summers warned that failure to pass President Obama's tax cut compromise would, quote, significantly increase the risk of a double-dip recession. President Obama predicted that members of his own party would eventually line up behind the compromise.
I think it is inaccurate to characterize Democrats writ large as feeling, quote-unquote, betrayed. I think Democrats are looking at this bill, and you've already had a whole bunch of them who've said this makes sense. And I think the more they look at it, the more of them are going to say this makes sense.
Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid said he hopes to start floor debate on the tax cut compromise in the next day or two.
I'm not going to talk about how I'm going to change the bill out here. There's some things I think that I would make the bill much better, and I'm going to work on those. Telling everybody here what I would like to do would be a good way to do whatever I want to do.
Joining me now are Congressman Alan Grayson, Arianna Huffington, co-founder and editor-in-chief of the Huffington Post, Ezra Klein, blogger for the Washington Post, and Robert Greenstein, founder and executive director of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and this year's winner of the Daniel Patrick Moynihan Prize from the American Academy of Political and Social Science. I want to begin, everyone, with Bob Greenstein's statement today about the deal. Bob, you wrote, "The deal between President Obama and Republican leaders on tax cuts and unemployment insurance has two substantial positive aspects. Its surprisingly strong protections for low and middle income working families, and its stronger than expected boost for the economy and jobs. Congress should approve this package. Its rejection will likely lead to a more problematic package that does less for middle and low income workers and less for the economy." Now, Bob, you may not be as familiar to our audience as some of the rest of our panel, but no one in Washington has worked on these issues longer than you have. No one has worked harder representing the interests of the people at the lower end of the tax brackets and below the bottom tax bracket, the poverty population in this country. There's been much concern about how this agreement is a giveaway to the rich at the expense of the middle class. There's been virtually no discussion of the poor in this agreement. There are other elements of the agreement that do affect the poor. How does that inform your decision about the total assessment of the bill?
Well, Lawrence, the difficult part in assessing this is it does have appalling giveaways for the rich in it that the Republicans insisted upon, but it also has terrific provisions, very important provisions, for middle-income people, unemployed workers, and low-income families and children. It extends for 13 months the additional weeks of unemployment benefits. No one expects the Republican House that'll take office in January to extend those benefits again. This was the last shot. Most people didn't think the White House would get more than 3 or 6 months. They got 13 months of those additional benefits, which are critical. And in 2009, President Obama secured in the Recovery Act a series of long-sought, by people who work on behalf of the working poor, long-sought tax credit improvements that lift millions of children out of poverty or make them less poor. Those were scheduled to expire at the end of the month. The Republicans were adamantly opposed to them. Those are all extended for 2 years in the bill. Here's the conundrum. What the Republicans said to the White House is, we insist on this really outrageous provision relating to the estate tax, which is a huge giveaway in the package. The White House originally said no. The Republicans said, fine, we'll leave the estate tax provision out, but then all of your provisions for millions of low-income working families and children die as well. So we've got $25 billion of really appalling giveaways for the top 0.25% of the estates in the country. And in return for that $25 billion, there's $40 billion in extremely important income support through tax credits for low and moderate income working families. So how do you assess that? For me, the bottom line is the following. I think that if the bill is defeated, a new negotiation will take place with the Congress that comes in January, and we'll end up with a much less good deal. All the odious parts will remain, and the positive parts on unemployment and for the working poor will get watered down or disappear. So much as I really detest parts of the package, I think the best thing to do is to approve it.
Congressman Grayson, you signed Congressman Welch's letter to Speaker Pelosi. We had Congressman Welch on the show last night. I want to read from that letter quickly. It says, "We oppose acceding to Republican demands to extend the Bush tax cuts to millionaires and billionaires for two reasons." That you then give your two reasons in the speech-making section. It's irresponsible. You say it's grossly unfair. You then go on to say at the end, we should support extending tax cuts in full to 98% of American taxpayers, as President Obama initially opposed. He should not back down, nor should we. The letter never says, it's signed by you and about 40 or 50 other members, it never says that you'll vote against the bill. It never says anything specific about what you'll actually do. Will you, Congressman Grayson, vote against the bill, given what you just heard from Bob Greenstein?
Yes, I will, and I'll tell you why. As the president very aptly put it, the right wing has held this country hostage and held the middle class hostage by saying they would not extend much-needed tax cuts for the middle class and the rich unless we caved in, and I use that term specifically, caved in, and gave them what they wanted concerning tax breaks for huge multinational corporations and also for the rich. There's been a tremendous amount of debate regarding the tax cuts for the rich. If you simply look, as I did tonight on the House floor, at the 9 years before we had these tax cuts for the rich and the 9 years since we've had these tax cuts for the rich, you'll realize what a pernicious effect they've had on the economy. But in addition to that, we have a whole new $150 billion tax break that's never even been floated before, which was slipped into this deal at the last minute without discussing it with anybody, and I mean anybody, among the Democrats in the House and the Senate. I've checked in the House, and I can tell you this wasn't discussed with anybody, and it applies only to large corporations. They're going to let large corporations have a write-off for everything they call investment next year, and they're going to reduce the corporate income tax to the tune of, this is the White House's figures, $150 billion next year. Now, I looked last year to see what the revenue was from the corporate income tax and found that last year the revenue from the corporate income tax was only $138 billion. So they are giving a 100% tax cut to large corporations only. And I mean large corporations only because small corporations already get to write off $250,000 of their investments, but no more than that. So taking this tax cut that was meant, this tax benefit that was meant for small corporations, and they're applying it to Microsoft, they're applying it to GE, they're applying it to huge multinational corporations to cut their taxes to zero next year, because some people in the White House evidently think that the real problem with the U.S. economy today is that corporations aren't making enough money.
Congressman, if you were to succeed at this and kill this bill, all tax rates would increase on January 1st. Do you know which bracket would actually be hit with the largest percentage increase?
Yes, the people who have dividend income.
Wrong, Congressman. Stop there. It's the bottom tax bracket, not the top tax bracket. The bottom tax bracket would go from 10% to 15%. That is a 50% increase in the bottom income tax bracket, the one that none of you Democrats ever talk about.
Respectfully,
let me go. Sir.
No, let me respond if I may.
In dollar terms, the money is at the top end, but in percentage terms, the question I asked is, tell me, when you're out of office in January and watching this from the sidelines, and the Republicans control the House of Representatives, I want you to tell me what you would say to Floridians in your district who are now going to be represented by a Republican. Tell me what you'd say to them who are in the 10% bracket now, the lowest bracket, that their income tax rate goes up 50% to 15% on the first week in that first paycheck they get in January. Tell me what you would say to them about why you allowed that to happen.
I would say your facts are wrong. The dividend rate goes from 15% to 39.6%. That's more than doubling. That's more than a 50% increase. So let's get our facts right before we ask questions.
I'm talking about income tax brackets. Now, you address for me the justification you would give to your constituents in the lowest income tax bracket of why their income taxes were allowed to go up by 50% in the first week of January. Tell me what you'd say to them.
I don't think that would happen, but I think you're missing the point.
It would happen if you get your way. You're missing the point. Stop being an adult about this, Congressman. If you get your way,
please, let's not insult each other with that kind of language. This is supposed to be the intelligent network.
If you get your way, the taxes go up.
No, I have supported a middle-class and working-class tax cut from day one. So, no, you can't blame me for this. You can blame the stubborn Republicans for it, for, as the president said, holding this country hostage. But you certainly can't blame Alan Grayson. And by no means should you ask me a question like that based upon a false premise and demand that I answer it.
The correct premise is that in the income tax brackets, the lowest bracket, which no Democrat ever discusses anymore, goes up by 50%. And that is something that people are willing to let happen on your side of the aisle in order to make an argument point against the irresponsible Republicans. Congressman, what you've discovered in the Congress is Democrats bear the responsibility of governing with the tax code in a responsible way, and Republicans have no sense of responsibility for it. Arianna Huffington, I want to bring you in. Some of your best friends used to be Republicans. You know better than any of us how obstinate, how absolutely irresponsible they are when it comes to the tax code. Is it worth risking what would happen with a Republican House of Representatives next year to allow this debate to go past January 31st and allow those tax rates to increase and then try to get a middle-class tax cut?
Well, first of all, Lawrence, it didn't have to be this way. The president was outmaneuvered in checkers. You know, this was really not at all the way it could have been. Remember, before the election, John Boehner went on television and said that he would be prepared to accept extending the tax cuts only for those earning $250 or below, rather than see them die. So there he had blinked first, and the White House and Congress had the opportunity at the time to go ahead and take that vote before the election, but they didn't do that, which they should have done. It's very clear now they should have done it. And instead, for me, the main problem with this deal, is that it doesn't address the question of how do you create jobs. It doesn't address the fact that Larry Summers himself, contradicting what he said today, back in September, he had said that instead of extending all the tax cuts, we needed to have targeted investments that would help create jobs. Today, he fear-mongered. It reminded me of the fear-mongering that was going on before the Iraq war when we were told that there were going to be mushroom clouds. It was the same fear of a double depression or recession if we did not extend all tax cuts. So it's back to fear-mongering. It's back to contradicting even things that the White House officials had said a few months ago, not even a few years ago, not even during the campaign. And it's a real lack of trust in what is happening, and we are not dealing with a fundamental problem that we are simply extending the status quo. And the status quo has given us 27 million people out of work or underemployed. There is absolutely nothing in this bill that's going to cost us close to $900 billion that's doing anything to change that.
Ezra Klein, quickly, Arianna's absolutely right that John Boehner was willing to make this compromise. It was Nancy Pelosi in the House of Representatives who made the decision to not go for the vote. Why didn't, as soon as Boehner said he was willing to make a compromise, publicly said he would vote for, the Democratic version of this bill if that was all he could vote for, why didn't Nancy Pelosi immediately put that vote in front of John Boehner?
It was not a great answer to it. 37 Democrats sort of threatened to defect on the vote, but also there were internal divisions in the White House. In the Senate, Democrats began negotiating with themselves. They had a chance to get their initial ask very early on, and they simply left it alone. They didn't do it. They began talking about a temporary extension. But I think quickly, before we go to break, I can't agree with Representative Grayson's perspective on the business tax cut. That tax cut isn't a secret. It was first proposed by the Obama administration in September. What it does is it takes investments, you usually get a deduction for that over time, and instead of giving it to them over 10 years, gives it to them in 1 year. So you're trying to pull investment forward from the future into 2011. Over the next 10 years, that would cost $30 billion, not $150 billion, and it isn't a zeroing out of the corporate tax rate. I take his point that, you know, you can argue the corporations pay too little already. They have mountains of profits they're sitting on, and so there's arguments about how effective it will be. But it isn't just a giveaway. It's an attempt to try to move investment from the future to here, and that does make some sense in the current situation when they have this level of profits they could spend if they wanted to.
We will
I'd like to respond to that.
Congressman,
Can I respond to that?
you will respond as soon as we come back. We will continue this discussion after the break.